Montreal in the 50s, people would always say to me, where are you from? Because there were hardly any Chinese families in Montreal in the 1950s. In my school, there were just 2. There were no Japanese, no Koreans, no Vietnamese, no Filipinos, nothing, just 2 Chinese families. And so they'd go, no, where are you really from, right? That's what you get. Where are you really from? And I'd go, the Montreal General. Now, my grandfather came here to Canada in 1880. He was one of several thousand Chinese brought in to build the Canadian Pacific Railroad. That's a very interesting story in itself. The immigrants built the railroad, but the European immigrants built it from the east across the prairies. It was flat, so it wasn't that hard. I'm not saying it was a picnic, but it was flat. And then they got to the Rockies and they go, oh my God. So what are we gonna do with this? And the problem was British Columbia was being very impatient. They said, we are not going to join Confederation unless you build that railroad, and there's a deadline. If you don't build that railroad by a certain year, we're out. So the whole fate of Canada depended on getting this railroad through the Rocky Mountains. So what did Canada do? What do we always do? We turned to the Americans and we said, well, how do we get this railroad through? And the Americans go, oh, we've done this. We're doing this right now. They were building their railroad across the continental U.S. through the Rockies, and they went to China because they said, we can get people there. First of all, they know nothing about the Rockies. You know, they won't know. We'll just tell them we need to build this railroad. How'd you like to job? And then when they get there, it'll be too late to go back home. I'm just making this up. But in fact, they did go to, no, all of that's true, but I don't know exactly what the conversation was in the back rooms when they said, let's get these Chinese. Anyway, they did go to the south of China. They got all these Chinese people who, because China was in a very bad economic state, a lot of starvation, a lot of war, and my grandfather was the 7th son. There was no more land for him. So he took up the offer. He came to Canada and helped build the railroad. That's how I ended up growing up in 3rd generation Canadian. I should tell you that when the railroad was completed in 1884, he was supposed to get his return passage back to China. He was supposed to do this work, and it was, you know, round trip passage on the ship was included. But of course, the American contractor disappeared. And so he was left with the choice of spending quite a substantial part of his savings to go back to China or staying in Canada. And so he stayed in Canada. In order to work, he had to actually pay a special tax. This is not the same as the head tax, but just to have the opportunity to work, he had to pay. And he did. And he ended up staying in BC, and eventually the family moved east. Now, I grew up on a street in Montreal called Rosedale Avenue. It was an entirely Jewish street, except for us. Somebody's nodding, she remembers. And my family's house was wedged between the synagogue and all the other Jewish families on the street. And I tell you this because one of the things we do in Canada, and I'm sure you're all going to do this, or you have all experienced this, but you are going to torture your children, or you have been tortured with your heritage lessons. Because my family, my parents were born in Canada, and they thought, oh, you have to learn Chinese, so they would torture me and my siblings with Chinese lessons on Friday night. And before I could go out and play, I'd have to write these Chinese characters on these funny pages with square boxes to teach you how to write a Chinese character, and I hated it. I couldn't see any point. Why do I have to do this before I can go out and play? I'd have to do like 20 of these words and 20 of these words. And then I'd go outside, I'd be crying, and I'd be really mad, and I'd tell my Jewish friends, I have to do Chinese before I go out and play. And they said, oh, we have to do Hebrew, you know, it's okay. This is Canada. Now, when I was in high school, there were still 2 Chinese families only, but there was 1 Japanese family. I think there was 1 black kid, and that was it. There were no other. I mean, there was a Jewish family. I went to a very waspy high school, so there's 1 Jewish family. And that was it for minorities. And I remember when I wanted to go to the dance, you know, the Friday night dances at school. And occasionally someone would ask me, not very often, but occasionally somebody would ask me to go to the dance. Great, except he was in Chinese, because like my brother's not going to ask me to the dance. And the other Chinese family was younger. So my mother would stand on the doorstep and wait for me to come home. And then she'd scream at this poor non-Chinese boy who had no idea what he'd done wrong, except that he didn't look Chinese. And I thought my parents were racist. I felt so angry with them. I just thought, you're so racist. Like, what is the problem? You see, in those days, they didn't teach us about the head tax, and they didn't teach us about the Exclusion Act. I'm sure you have learned, right, about the head tax in school? Do you know? I'm going to ask this kid in the third row who's chewing gum with a hoodie on.
No.
You don't